So, our topic. Let's get going. Let's have a look here.
Take us for liftoff, man.
All right. Okay. Well, awesome. Thanks for coming down. I appreciate you coming down, and it's exciting. We're getting our first episode off the ground, hopefully. I guess as we discussed, our first topic would be, related to how is being a visible minority informed our leadership and experiences around that. And, I think we've talked a bunch about it. I thought we wanted to put it on wax here. So
before we go there, though, you want to talk about what we're trying to accomplish from episode to episode?
Right? Yeah.
Cool. I think that 85 to 90% of our conversations are under the branch of, or under the tree of mental wellness and modern masculinity and how that shows up in our day-to-day lives. And you've made a great point almost every time that we connect, that we appreciate each other's company as it comes from both a different socioeconomic space as well as different upbringing and also different race. So I think it's really, really cool, whatever we aim to discuss here, and race is something we're going to discuss shortly, that we'll be able to bring these, try to find some sort of intersection and to create new intersections for the listener to also hop in and to create their own conversations surrounding all these things.
I love that you mentioned the word intersection, because a lot of what I do in sort of research has what we call an intersectional view, which is basically a lot of things you discussed. All parts of our identity, age, race, religion, location, culture, all that is relative to who we are. And I think we should never deny that, and we should never vilify anybody for any part of it. We should just recognize we all come as a package, and that's how it works. So.
Yeah, and I think that the package there is really important when it comes to our environments. And I think that's something. You want to hop into the environment?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, perfect. So it's interesting to me because I'm an Asian dude, obviously, and Orrett and I are mostly based in British Columbia. So I'm actually a majority there, but in different environments, I'm also a minority. When in my former life, when I was aiming to be an elite sports journalist, not many Asian parents would have approved of that route. They would have been something else. So, but then do you want to share recently the trip that you had to down south to Atlanta, Georgia? I think that was something that you were able to. I think what we spoke on before this was there's the difference between being the subconscious impact of othering and how just being different versus being invisible impacts our psyche.
Yeah, thanks for that. So as Gabe mentioned, I recently had a trip. My first trip to Atlanta was in late October of last year. Now, I am very well versed in geopolitics and all those kinds of things, and I'm very understanding of what the U.S. is like. But I had never traveled to the South, as it were. And so I've been to Seattle and other things where there are more people who identify as Black, but it's not the same. So when I arrived there, one of the first things I noticed, which was that everyone was Black. I don't mean that hyperbolically. I mean that almost literally. And so that was a new experience for me in being in the U.S. I'd been to other places, but here it was different in that I got off the plane and I just felt like one person in the crowd. And so I think the story I told you, we were at a store and my brother and his son were there, and we were shopping, and I'm like, okay, this is excellent. I'm going to just hang out behind them and they're going to see me. And then I turned my back and they were gone. I was like, what do you mean? And then so I looked around, I couldn't find them. And then I walked out of the store and I was looking around, and I actually had to take a moment to find them. And when I ran into them, they're like, hey, where did you go? I'm like, I was right behind you. Like, we couldn't find you. I'm like, what do you mean you couldn't find me? He's like, yeah, we couldn't find you. Everyone's got dreads here. I'm like, oh my gosh, right? It was funny, but upon reflecting on it, it was just something that, this would never happen to me here. And leading into the other part of it, whereas here, I generally feel very noticeable. Skin color, hairstyle, style of dress, as I walk around, reminded, sometimes overtly, sometimes, a little bit more subtly, that I am different. And having that experience as an adult at almost 50 years old and being able to reflect on it in my current state, it was very powerful and impactful. And I shared with you, I shared my brother, that I wept while I was there, and not because I was really sad, but because I was like, oh my gosh, this is how regular people who are in a space where they don't feel differently other, this is how they carry themselves. They just want everybody, right?
I think that how our brains respectively process that normalization of being othered is something that we can touch on as well, because there's, most people in the academic space have heard or discussed white privilege ad nauseum. However, being on the other side of that and all the branches that white privilege creates, being the other in so many situations, you just accept that's also always part of the condition. I feel like one of my favorite parts of is the contrast principle. For example, I've read a book where there's a marketing professor, Psychology of Money, a marketing professor by Morgan Housel. He speaks on one of his best friends, now works in finance with him as well, but his family is from Africa. So every single time, even though he's well off now, every single time that he has a hot meal, he's still amazed, because that just wasn't the norm there, and it's become, no matter how far you get removed from that direct environment, it still bears on you.
You still carry that around. You mentioned white privilege, but what I do want to identify is that whiteness and privilege are two separate constructs, right? So, and for a long time, I only heard those two words together, as in white privilege. And as I got older and more understanding, I'm like, okay, well, I have a lot of privilege. Maleness, socioeconomically.
Handsomeness.
Yes, I didn't want to say, right, but you're not lying. But also, I don't have any visible or invisible disability, as it were. Once I was able to break that construct up, I'm like, oh, okay, well, whiteness is not a precursor to privilege, but it does go together. So I just like the idea that the concept's broken up, because what I don't want to get into this idea that, okay, only white people have privilege, and that's not true. We all have some level of privilege. If you're walking around existing, it's just where you are, which leads us back to this discussion of intersectionality, where you and I have different levels of privilege. You may have a high level of privilege depending on where we are.
100%.
Depending on what we do. And so I think if you understand that, you'd be like, oh, okay, well, again, I live in Richmond as well, and there's a very high population of Chinese and Asian people across the diaspora in Richmond, and there's a very low concentration of people who identify as Black. And so it's like, okay, well, I would walk around somewhere and if I saw a whole group of Asian people, I wouldn't say, okay, well, is Gabe there? I'd be like, okay. On the other hand, if there was 100 people and you were there, it wouldn't be easy for me to find you. I would have to go and look at everybody's face.
Yep.
Whereas the opposite, if I was in that group of 100 people and you came up, you're like, oh, okay, well, there's the Black guy. Not because I'm a Black guy, but because I actually literally am different from the homogenous group. It would be easy to identify me. And those distinctions mean that if you're in that group, you're anonymous. I'm in that group, I am not anonymous, regardless of what's going on.
Breaking it down, though, as we have moved further and further away from when my family initially came in 1997 to with everything that's happening back home in Hong Kong in 1997 when Hong Kong was scheduled to be headed back to Chinese regime. As we have moved further and further down the line, like people from Hong Kong predominantly speak a dialect of Chinese called Cantonese. And over the past 9 years, now when I go to certain places, it's almost inferred that we speak Mandarin now as more and more people from the mainland of China come through and inhabits this place. So I think that's another topic as well, like that I feel, even though I'm in the visible majority, as we've come to a different time of British Columbia, Lower Mainland history, and then the demographics changing within the Asian population, I've become, or at least the way I communicate with my family has become the minority, and it almost, when anecdotally, when I go to certain places and they try to speak Mandarin to me as my first point of entry, and for the listener, my Mandarin is not great, I would say. My English, Cantonese, and then Mandarin would be my hierarchy of mastery. In a way, I almost go, I reply in English, because I don't want to lose that. What I've worked really hard to become adequate at, but I feel like in that one moment, in that split second, if I make the decision, if I reply in Mandarin, that hands over the autonomy of the conversation and privilege to an extent to you. Like, why do you get to dictate the terms here when I want to be able to, I've worked hard to be able to speak the native language here.
I guess what I'm hearing is that you're hearing that the assumption that because you look like me, you speak the identical language is something. It's an assumption. And then you may prefer to be like, well, I don't speak excellent Mandarin, and maybe you don't want to. Then that would be your choice, right? I'm going to respond in English, and then I'll see what you do, right? I'm assuming, so let's almost like you're throwing it back. I'm going to assume you speak English, right?
I mean,
right?
Where are we right now? Where are we talking about environment, right?
Right. So that's interesting. I think that even in that sort of nuance, people outside of knowledge of Chinese culture might say, well, you're Chinese, don't you speak Chinese?
Yeah.
And therein lies, that's an intersectional point right there. The predominant majority at one time spoke Cantonese. That evolved over time to maybe the needle pointing towards Mandarin. But when you came here, it was Cantonese. And so there was no real need for you to learn that because it is the same language but different, dialects.
Yes.
There's nuance, and it's not like just because you know one, you're automatically knowing everything about the other. And I think people sometimes maybe assume that Cantonese Mandarin is the same thing, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah, it would be. I think the best analog would be like French Canadian, like Quebecois French, and then like French or French. So, but it's ever so interesting though, because I find that the way that I respond to that initial piece, I don't think the other person's consciously thinking about it, but we're all about the subconscious here, or I'm all about the subconscious. I shouldn't speak on both of us. I feel that it would. If I were to respond in Mandarin, I would probably get treated better, inherently. But at the same time, if we're talking about leadership and talking about being an example of living what you want to preach, I think people so often talk about diversity, equity, inclusion now. I think part of my job is, for them, they might feel like it would be inclusive if I respond to them in turn. However, for me, I found when I was a kid here, it was really annoying when I would spend time with my family, and then they would create this little bubble of just speaking Cantonese, and people around would be like, what are you saying? What are you saying? So for me, and I think that's true, that's a mirror as well, right? Like, so every time I speak English, they don't understand at 100%, and every time they speak Mandarin, I'm not getting 100%. But I want to give that piece of, hey, let's not inherently create that division here when there's still people around us that are still speaking. I feel like they're reading the room there, where there's more people still speaking who have a grasp of English, as opposed to me having to specialize to what you're saying to me.
It seems like there's a lot of cultural nuance there. Because, right, maybe we all speak English, but maybe not so well. Maybe there's a percentage that speak Cantonese so well, and maybe there's some that speak a little bit both. Culturally and socially, you've identified, well, maybe if I spoke the language you wanted me to speak, I may get better treatment. Yeah. That is a cultural commentary relative to a lot of things we can't get into. But I think that's interesting, because that happens in a lot of places, like in the Caribbean, like, you'll find people who are from the country, as it were. Their English is what would, in the pejorative, be called broken. Well, really, it's just dialect. The language here evolved in a way, and if they were to come to another part, although we're essentially speaking the same language, you may not understand really well words, tones, inflections, because it hasn't evolved here. Whereas you're in this area, maybe it's more clear or more closer to English, but it's still the same language, like patois. So I don't know if you've seen this, the Bob Marley movie recently. There's a biopic.
It's on Apple TV, but
there you go. Yeah, so it's in the queue.
Yes.
I just remember reading an article about how they decided they were going to do a concerted effort to get a linguist and not try and or speak what we call fake patois, in that a set of language that is designed for the listener who is Western, primarily English speaking, and just say we're gonna speak the language as it was spoken in that time by these people and how it evolved. We're not going to anglicize it, as it were. And I respected that because that takes time and effort and someone has to do it. But it's just interesting about your description about how the language and nuance around Cantonese versus Mandarin, and actually how you felt about it. You described a feeling that maybe I may get different treatment if I spoke this way, but I'm going to respect my own agency. I'm going to do what I think I want to do, what suits me, what's better for me.
And if we were to tie this back to your Atlanta experience, as we head into the final stages of our opening stanza here, I feel like the way I had, if I were to respond in Mandarin, it'd be the same as if, having grown up and to be a big admirer of African American culture, when, for lack of a better term, a dark-skinned individual meets another dark-skinned individual, there's certain handshakes that they do, right? And I feel like the commissioner of the NBA is really, really funny. His name's Adam Silver. He's a Jewish bald guy in his late 50s, early 60s. But when he selects players for the NBA draft, 90% of the time when an African American is selected, he'll give him like the open handshake. But when a white guy gets drafted, it'll be the formal, traditional handshake. So I think also probably in Atlanta, you were probably able to just dap people up for
I guess I didn't find too much dapping people, but I did find more casual interaction that seemed seamless. For example, it was weird when I met IHOP in just some suburb of Atlanta, and I went to the bathroom and I put the soap in my hand and I smelled it first because I'm really sensitive to smells. Yeah. I didn't want to wash my hands with this thing if it was going to be disgusting. Yeah, I know. I'm like, dude, I'd rather be dirty and go get another wash somewhere else. Because sometimes it stays. Anyway.
Yeah.
So the guy next to me is like, you know what? We're so similar as humans. He was implying that
as you were smelling.
As I smelled, he's like, oh my gosh, you know what? We're so similar as human beings. Like we gotta know stuff, right? Because he had really immediately identified with the fact that he also wanted to check the smell of the soap. Because he was right there, right, and so he's like, I'm like, yeah, we are. It's really interesting. He's like, yeah, man, like you got to know stuff.
So, what flavor was it?
Oh, I didn't taste it.
Well, what did it smell like? Sorry. Obviously, we're not promoting unsafe sanitary habits.
No, I would say the smell was satisfactory, non-industrial, not disgusting. Right? And so I knew that if I washed my hands, I wasn't going to reek of this, and it was going to blow my mind. But he just made this comment, and after he was like, you know what? You have a good day, man.
And he was another black man?
Yeah. Just walked out. I'm like, that was totally cool. Just regular interaction, no, nothing. And it was those little things where it was just frictionless. He was a human being. We happened to just go pee. We were washing hands. And he noticed another person and thought to share that thought.
Human things, right?
Right, and that was it. He just walked out after, and I thought that was totally cool. So I did like that, and so
comparing and contrasting that to here.
Oh, no one talked to me in the bathroom here. I got to tell you that. Right
well, now. Even me. I was before Orrett was finding some parking, so I did earlier. So I was buying myself some time, so I went to buy some candy. Yeah. Standing in line, there's like 6 people in line in front of me. Like, this must be the best candy in the world. Damn, I was like, looking around like, I feel like I'm a presentable person. Like no one even engages with eye contact. It's just like you're either on your phone or you're just, I don't know, you're in your own space thinking about the affordability crisis or some shit like that. It would be so easy, but part of me has to take that. Why does it become my responsibility to almost break that trend or to be a part of the minority, to have a small, all I want is that, what you just described. You're like, what candy are you getting to? Or what are you getting?
I found that
would be amazing.
Funny you mentioned that. When I finally go to the stores in Atlanta, I found that greetings were not a perfunctory thing to say, I have to greet you, so I say hello. Something that we do just because it's this is what we do. I come in the store, you greet me just so we're clear. It was like, hey man, how's it going today? Right? Or how you doing? Whatever. And then they would just go about their business, and you know what? And that was that. And oftentimes, even in restaurants, they would just come and say hello and just start up a conversation. Not like, hey, you want to buy something? Or here, we have this on sale. That wasn't the entry point. It was like, I address you as another human being who happens to be here shopping, and basically if you need help, you know that I'm here. If not, then that's cool too, right? And when you did need help, people were like, okay, it wasn't like they were trying to go out of their way to be super attentive. They were just like, okay, we need help, what can we do?
Yeah.
And the vibe of it was just generally different. And I guess leading back to the central thing about that is that relative to our intersectional position and race, as it were, when I come into stores here, I very often get what you sort of described as just indifference towards me. And I can attribute that to a lot of different things. It's not always about my race or gender or whatever else, but sometimes I do feel when I walk into the store, I see someone else walk into the store and they get attention immediately in a way that I recognize people should, and I don't, then that leads me to believe, okay, I think this may be something related to my identity, and that is what it is. But as a segue to our primary topic, right, we were talking about, well, actually, we're trying to demonstrate, what modern masculinity looks like. We're dudes of, different races and backgrounds, and basically showing itself in how we navigate our leadership responsibilities, experiences, lives, whatever. I mean, for me, in higher education, I'm one of very few. And so I found that I've had a specific impact, and also a specific response to me has changed over the years. I've been doing this 15 years, and I've seen it in a lot of ways.
I think two things for me. One would be not allowing privilege to become a barrier. So one thing I'm very active in doing, and is treating everyone the same way. Going back to the retail experience, like I'm in the store, I'm not above, no matter what store I'm at, I'm not above like asking you how your day was. Because there's so often that I probably get this like once a day where like someone asks me, like, how are you? Like, could so easily just be like, walk past, or like, pretend not to hear you, put some headphones on. But I will, as much as humanly possible, I'll say like, good, and how are you? Just to give them that entry point back, like a little, and then sometimes it'll just be like shocked, and be like, thank you for asking. Be like, how else would I do it? Because like this is, we're humans, we need to respect each other, right? And on the note of respect, as an authority figure in the local basketball space, I think an example of how to be as inclusive as possible that I was active about was respecting how different cultures approached coming out of COVID. So a direct example of that is not as much anymore, but like say late 2022, early 2023, some people could still come, some athletes might still pull up in a mask. No problem, not going to discuss that with them, still going to treat them the same way. But I will actively, if they're wearing a mask, to me that also means they're probably still there, or their family are still very conscious about this virus. So as much as possible, I will do like fist bump. Just those small gestures. Be like, I feel and I hear and I see. You don't need to say it. Mm-hmm. Fist bump, as opposed to be like force it. Even though a high five is what was the cool word you used again?
Perfunctory?
Perfunctory, yeah, the perfunctory function of congratulations in an athletic environment. Yeah. However, are we able to take ourselves off that pedestal and have other acceptable consequences?
I do like that. I actually prefer the fist bump. Sometimes I find it because...
Why don't you meet with a handshake?
I know. I was just going to say that. Because so many times I'm like, it's default. I've been doing it for so many years. Like, boom. I've been doing it for so many years. I'm like this. And I'm like, actually, no. I actually prefer the fist bump. But sometimes it even comes back to me like I'm meeting somebody new. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, okay, so shake or bump? Like, do I? And it's a little battle that I go on. I'm like, I should just do this all the time because that's what I prefer to do. And it's still an evolution. I still have to actually think.
And less than because they're doing that. I think that's so important. Like, right. Why are we judging off of like these cues that don't affect our overall performance in our environment that we're doing?
So they're not really. They are obligated.
You shake my hand at a job interview. Does that mean that you will be a harder worker 3 months down the line after I.
Well, it's interesting you mention that because sometimes people.
We don't want to go too far.
But like a firm handshake is something that's a thing. People talk about it, right? But that's judgment related to what it means. But anyway, we're getting off topic. Let's get back to our.
Wrap us up here, man.
Right. So I guess back to leadership. You talked about being leadership in basketball, coaching. People may know you were a coach of many different teams over the years and everything else. And for me, it's mostly in education. So I show up, I teach students, typically 18 to 30 somethings. And what I find most impactful for me sometimes, at the beginning of the year, I like to play this joke. I actually I wait till students come in, and sometimes I'll roll in, I'll sit down. And because I sometimes can pass for someone who's a little bit younger than myself, it's not always assumed that I would be, the person who's teaching the class. And a couple times this happened where people have just assumed that I'm a student. And so, I do like that. But oftentimes, it's only happened a couple times, but I've been the person who go up and something like, they've had a visible response and change in demeanor when they realized that I was the person who was going to be in front of them as opposed to one of their peers.
Right.
And now that's not the normal response, but it has happened. And so that to me is another reminder that, okay, my image represents something to somebody regardless, just as yours does to me. And I now have to understand that in this space, I am different or other. And as I've said lots of times to other people, is that oftentimes I've found that I'm the first person of color, or maybe a black male, who's been in any kind of position of authority over any of them. Because the doctor, the lawyer, the dean, none of those people identify as black and male typically. And so you're used to seeing a certain type or group fill out these roles. But in this case, it's not that. And so sometimes I find that I met with a certain level of skepticism at first. And before that used to bother me, but now I'm like, okay.
Not a visible ceiling per se.
Correct. But now I'm like, you know what? That's what it is for you. It is what it is. I'm not going to judge you for this. I'm going to do what I would do normally, is I'm going to earn your trust by doing the things I do. I set up the culture. I tell them I'm going to model it. I'm going to do my best. And if it doesn't work for you, then you call it out. You say what you say. We've got some rules on how we discuss things in our classroom. And I think once you sort of get past the veneer of our identity and you allow yourself to get to know and to have empathy and vulnerability with another person, to be like, okay, well, it's not about not seeing their color, it's about getting to know a person. Because I don't like this sort of like, I don't see color. I don't think that's a great idea.
Am I able to hop in here?
Yes, sir, of course.
Thank you. So I think that's kind of to provide the audience with a little bit of takeaway, because for me it's always about like what are we doing outside of here. So to me it's a jump off of I don't see color. I also think that's a load of what. So I think it's important for me I'm very conscious of how everything matters. So in the way that we are approaching our day-to-day interactions with people, similar to what I talked about at, I don't know, the 15-minute mark or something, with responding in one language that's different than the other. I'm conscious of it. I've thought about it. I'm accepting the consequence of how I react to it. And one of your many great philosophies, which I've adopted, is where's our notes here?
Space.
Yeah, but like the first one is like embracing your autonomy and your decisions, or something along those manners, right?
I'll pull it up. Get it back over there. It's slow. There we go.
Then we can wrap up for today. But yeah, owning your intentions and your impact.
Yes.
Right? Regardless of what the culture is and what the intersection is of that moment, you have choices to make. And when you slow down enough and observe enough to be like, all right, this is the action I'm taking. It's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to try this. And depending on how the other person responds, you have another opportunity to continue down the upward trajectory.
I think you're describing this ownership of the words. I've thought about it, what I say and how I respond, and you may not agree or even like it, but I think I can take ownership of what that is, and I shouldn't be incentivized to acquiesce or conform because you don't like it. I think I responded this way intentionally, and I think that's ownership. And I think what that challenges other people, okay, well, you didn't respond to me in the language that I think that you should speak. I want to do this, but you didn't. So they have choice, right? They can double down and say, no, I'm going to, or they could, okay, well, they make a different choice. And I think that ownership is actually contagious. If I take ownership of my thing and you disagree or you whatever, if you take ownership, I think it creates a much more authentic conversation because now I'm not trying to make sure that you like me or you agree or that you are happy with what I say. I'm going to say what I'm going to say and you're going to say what you're going to say and we respect each other for saying it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think anecdotally, to conclude, I think that ownership piece is so contagious. Having traveled to Japan a couple times, all of the garbage cans don't exist in public spaces. They exist slightly outside the door. And then if you see all those spaces are super, super clean, because like you are responsible for whatever thing that is in your hand. You don't just throw it anywhere. We go outside of the room and we keep the spaces that we all share as cleanly as possible.
There's a place to throw the garbage and it's not here.
Right, man. Thank you.
All right, that was awesome. Okay.